Ethical Perspectives on the News is produced by the Interreligious Council of Linn County, which is solely responsible for its content. The views and opinions expressed on this program do not necessarily reflect those of the staff and management of KCRG TV9.
Good morning. Welcome to this week's edition of Ethical Perspectives on the News. My name is Craig VanSandt. I teach at the University of Northern Iowa and hold the David W. Wilson Chair in Business Ethics there. Our topic this morning is on the importance of the free press. The press is increasingly the subject of the news rather than a vehicle for delivering us the current events. As we've often heard recently, presidents in the United States have had contentious relationships with the press. However, with the current administration, it has gone to the point of being called the enemy of the American people. In this week's edition of the show, we want to examine the historical place that the press holds in our republic, the legal basis of its relationship with our government, and the importance or lack thereof in our society today. To help us with this inquiry, we've gotten three very good panelists. First, we have Lyle Muller, Executive Director of Iowa Watch and former editor of the Gazette in Cedar Rapids. Lyle, thank you for being with us.
Thanks for having me.
Second is Cristina Tilley, a professor at the University of Iowa Law School, and I just learned a former journalist as well. Cristina, thank you.
Thank you.
And finally, we have Frank Durham, a professor of journalism, also at the University of Iowa. Frank, thank you for being on the show with us.
It's fun. It's always a pleasure.
Good. As I've said earlier, we're here to talk about the importance of a free press in our society today. Frank, I'd like to start by asking you a question. As a professor of journalism, can you give us an understanding of the role that journalism typically plays in a democracy? And I understand it's also referred to as the fourth estate. Could you talk to us about what those other estates are?
Sure. The fourth estate refers to the place of the press in surveilling or being the watchdog for the three branches of government: the legislative, the judicial, and the executive. And so it's not and the law. The First Amendment refers to what Congress can't do about the free press, which is to inhibit it. But the role of the press in American democracy is principally traditional.
Okay. And I understand there is now a fifth estate. Are you familiar with that?
No, tell me about that.
Well, I've heard it's the blogosphere,
Oh.
the online commentary.
Yeah, that's an interesting notion. In the mid-'80s, we had what's referred to as a sort of modernist period of journalism, where the three television networks dominated and were fairly unified, and the national news agenda was fairly consistent and homogeneous. And with the internet, about in the mid-'90s, the whole notion of a unified public space that created by journalism was disposed of in favor of a fragmented mediascape, and you can't put the toothpaste back in the tube.
I'd like to come back and revisit that question in a minute, but let me turn to you, Cristina. Could you talk about the legal status? Frank mentioned the First Amendment. That obviously has a lot to do with it, but from a legal standpoint, what role does the press play?
Well, it's interesting. We don't have a whole lot of terribly detailed information on exactly what the framers had in mind when they drafted the First Amendment, but we think in general they were hoping to achieve 3 or 4 major things. One of them, of course, is to seek truth. The idea that every idea gets on the field of play. The good ones thrive, the bad ones fall away. and that the government has no role in letting those ideas on the field or keeping them off. And then subsidiary to that, the First Amendment was designed to facilitate a self-governing people doing democracy, basically. And the press, of course, is crucial to achieving that goal. It's not the only actor that can help people fulfill their role in a democracy, but it's really ideally positioned to do that. It has institutional expertise, it has a financial incentive to do it, it has time, and it has the technological means to disperse information to the people about their representatives, agencies, and so forth. And then finally, as Frank alluded to, we think of the First Amendment as playing sort of a checking role. The idea that the government should be watched, should be checked when it's acting in a way that might be irresponsible or excessive or unethical. And there again, lots of actors can participate in checking the branches of government, but the press is really sort of first among equals in that activity. They're just really good at it and have a lot of experience in it.
And what strikes me as you're talking about this is the structure of our government has checks and balances in it, but obviously the founders didn't think that would be sufficient if they're also including the press as another watchdog.
Yeah, I mean, it's the only private business that's mentioned in the Constitution. So they clearly thought that that it had a role to play in government that was unique among private actors.
Okay, and let me ask you one more question while we're there. If the press was so important, why was it not part of the original Constitution?
Yeah, you might wonder that. I don't think you can really draw any anti-speech or anti-press inferences from that. Really, that first original document was designed to set up a government of limited powers. And I think that there was a hope or an expectation that if the government was sufficiently limited, if we didn't authorize Congress to prohibit the press from doing certain things, that it wasn't really necessary to spell out that the press had the right to do as it wished. But there wasn't, in some quarters there was some political discomfort with not having that spelled out. And so when the movement for the Bill of Rights arose, that was considered important to spell out.
Okay. Lyle, let me put you on the hot seat now. As being intimately involved with the big picture of press as the executive director of the Iowa Watch, where do you see the press, in quotes, being today? What's its status?
Well, the status is it's as vibrant as ever. There are more outlets that you can get news and information from than ever, and that's because it's not a regulated industry. You think about the independent press, if you had an independent press that was regulated, that just doesn't make sense. I know a lot of people ask me, why aren't you required to get certified? Nurses have to get certified, lawyers have to get certified, doctors, all of these people, they have to get continuing education, and that's just not the nature of an independent watchdog. The goal for a working journalist is to tell the truth, seek the truth, tell the truth, and let that be the guide. And there certainly are guidelines for us. There is training that you get in school. There are guidelines that you get from organizations such as Society for Professional Journalists. But when you ask about the state of the current press, and I include in that radio, television, newspapers, online, all of these different avenues that we get our information from, I think there's a deep concern, one, of the attack that's going on of working journalists whose job it is to tell the truth, an attack by people who say that they are merely trying to do that so that they can confuse the electorate, so that whatever is said by the working press that you don't agree with, you can just say it's not true. That's a dangerous thing that we're running into, because the shoe can turn on that kind of approach. The other thing that's going on is that we ourselves as an industry have inflicted ourselves with some wounds. There was a great problem 10, 15 years ago with a revolution that happened in our industry, and that was disruptive technologies such as the internet that changed the structure for funding journalism. People have never paid for journalism. They've paid advertisement dollars that then subsidize good journalism in television, radio, and newspapers, and that has changed. So we have 40% fewer working journalists in this country than we did 26 years ago. We have fewer reporters, but this is important also. We have fewer editors. Editors are the fact checkers. They're the ones who go through and detect the logical lapses in a reporter's story. And keep in mind, reporters are writing stories quickly on deadline. You always need a couple of editors for your reporting.
Well, again, as a follow-up question, you say the funding model for journalism has changed. Do you have solutions for that?
No, and that's one of the problems that exist. A great number of commercial, traditional news outlets, the Gazette Company, Employee Stock Option Program, trying to solve this issue. Gannett, a large company trying to solve this issue, the Gannett owner of the Des Moines Register, Woodward Communications out of Dubuque trying to solve the problem, Lee Enterprises owns the Waterloo Cedar Falls Courier trying to solve the problem. But you also have a group of nonprofits. That's what I belong to. I'm a nonprofit news organization, and I can recall going to a conference in Los Angeles in 2012, and about 30 of us got together, and at the end of it, the convener said, I've called you all together here because I think that you can help us create an industry here that would self-sustain itself. And here it is 6 years later, and we're still trying to find the answer to that too. And the reason for that is because people are accustomed to getting news free. One, news is a public good. It's important for us to be informed. But two, the connection of the expense to produce news versus how much you're willing to pay for it. There's not a good connection there, so that people are willing to flat out pay the full cost of collecting and writing and reporting a news story.
Okay. Well, we're appearing on KCRG as part of their public service facility. We don't pay them anything. Cristina, do you think that would be a start as a way to fund independent journalism?
You mean to have existing news operations sort of open access?
Or, you know, instead of however many hours KCRG has to provide each week, double that or triple it?
I guess, in theory, if they wanted to do that voluntarily, to turn over the airwaves to, right-thinking people and, let us talk about deep issues, that sounds like a great thing to do. I find it problematic in a couple of ways. One, this is an ABC affiliate, and ABC is a public company, publicly held. They've got shareholders that probably would rather that time be given to someone who's going to sell ads. And I'm sure people are loving this, but I don't know how many ads the four of us are going to be able to sell. So if there's not a financial incentive for KCRG to do that, how are we going to encourage them to do it? That starts looking like the government in some way or another, asking that the airwaves be opened up, and that looks problematic. That starts looking like the government making editorial decisions, and that has First Amendment problems, I think, associated with it.
There are people suggesting that government subsidize the press, but the whole question becomes, how can a government subsidized entity be a watchdog of government? And then there's the political practical matter of how many people want to pay taxes to support the press, especially if it's reporting things that they disagree with politically.
What do you think? I'm curious. What do you think of the move of many of the bigger companies to go back behind paywalls?
I think it's a good idea.
I'm paying them. The Washington Post gets my monthly credit card charge. the Times does. I take the Press Citizen, the Gazette, of course. I pay for it because my life depends on it. Our democracy depends on it. The Washington Post tagline is "Democracy dies in darkness," and this is a moment where we need a watchdog press more than ever. The ox is in the ditch, and the whole notion that truth could be challenged in the way that it's been challenged by the Trump White House and the Republican Party is just stark and striking. There's a long tradition in the conservative movement dating back to the period just after World War I of anti-science antagonism, and the conservative movement at that point retreated to its own media, to its own books, its own magazines, its own brochures, its sermons in some cases. And they did that because they were anti-empiricists. They wanted a place to reproduce and husband their ideas and beliefs without being challenged by those sort of vogue of sociologically informed religion in the New Gospel, but also by the recently professionalized press. Walter Lippmann's idea of journalism as being a scientific enterprise was countered directly by the Christian fundamentalists who withdrew from examination. And what we have today is is just a vestige of that. But fueled by the internet, it's a challenge to the basis of fact as a common social point of reference in political debate and social debate. And the idea that there could be one truth versus another truth is postmodern at best.
Well, that brings us, I think, to an interesting question. We all have our biases. How do we identify facts? What we are so comfortable talking about as an identifiable thing?
Well, I think we show our methods. Reporters use attributions for the most part, although there's always a controversy about reports that rely overly much on anonymous sources. We make verification by readers possible. And in fact, I can't reach the U.S. Senate to find out what they're really thinking. I need a national newspaper or news organization to do that for me. But there's a kind of transparency involved, and a willingness to correct, a willingness to recognize that this is a pragmatic process that's done on the daily schedule, and that it will be subject to examination by the readers and correction by the readers back to the press. And so there's more than a method in that, but it's a system of knowing ourselves. And again, the very idea that somebody could talk about an alternate reality, going back to Cass Susskind's line from the Bush administration, is something that just has to be challenged. There is truth. There is empirically derivable truth. There are facts. And the meaning around them is something we should approach in a sense of comedy and open debate. But the facts themselves should be held in common.
Okay.
One of the benefits that we have of the internet era is we're able to link in our stories to source material, so that people can go to the source material, read that, reach your own conclusions, also challenge you. And by the way, the source material I have found has been a great method for me fact-checking stories. Spellings of names. Did I get this correct? Is the word not in this sentence or not? Big difference if he did not do it or did do it. So that type of transparency is important, and I think the credible news organizations are doing that.
Can I play devil's advocate for a minute? The people I talk to in my daily life who want to be good citizens, they want to follow their government, they want to vote, they want to be active, but they're living lives. They have a lot to do, and they have expressed to me a lot of times that they can go back and click and look at source material, or they can follow up day 2, but they feel like that a lot of that is they're being asked to shoulder a pretty heavy burden, that they're being asked to sift through and find the truth. And they really don't know. They say, I want one source I can rely on, that's easy, that fits into my day, that I can just sort of read, digest, and move forward. And they feel like they're being asked to look at, 3 sources to sift through the truth. Do you think that's,
Fox News follows those people whole. They're uncritical and they're lacking media literacy. It is a job to be in a democracy. It is a citizen's privilege to work that hard. It is the minute we submit to the news reader as a consumer, as a passive participant in the practice of journalism and vetting our democracy, we're sunk. And that's the paywalls and the business model are part of it. But a willingness to suspend disbelief and to let one voice speak is where we have access to a totalitarian society, and so there.
And I would say, that there are organizations that are doing that. They are trying to tell the truth. What they're doing is getting called false with no evidence, and after a long period of time of that being pounded into people's head, whether it be by talk radio or now the internet, and now from the bully pulpit in the White House, that starts sticking. And so that's why I think the transparency becomes valuable, because it's all right to question what we're doing. At Iowa Watch, it's all right to question. When I was at the Gazette, I thought it was always all right to question what we were doing. Is that true? Are you being as accurate as possible? And that transparency shows that this is the homework we've done. So please take a look at it if you're going to criticize us.
I think that leads into another question that I had that I'd like to hear from all of you on. I've never worked as a journalist, so I'm by far the least informed here. But my understanding is that for at least newspaper organizations, there is a news side and an editorial side. And supposedly the two don't ever talk to each other and don't influence each other. I've seen, or I think I've seen, a blurring of that line. Is that a valid concern, or should I not worry about that?
Yeah, the two sides will talk. They'll exchange information, factual information, try to make sure that they're following topics that are germane to the community. But I think what you're really talking about is this notion of how journalists have become talking heads. And so a journalist used to write their story, put it in a newspaper, and I know a lot of journalists who didn't even want people to know. They wanted people to know their name was on the story, but they didn't want to be associated with the story as far as a point of view. They were trying to be that pure. Whether they were or not is debatable, I believe. But what we're into now is this notion of we're super bloggers where we promote our own stories. So we say, look at my story, and we have provocative headlines, but we also show up on television shows to talk about it. Mm-hmm. And so I'll see some of my favorite reporters who, by the way, are University of Iowa graduates and doing great work at places like Politico and the Washington Post covering what's going on in Washington, and I'll look up on the screen and I'll see them talking. And try as they may to talk about just facts, an interviewer is, I tell you, an interviewer is just going to ask them, what do they think? And that's where you kind of get into that slippery slope, and then people start thinking, that's what they think. And those impressions, I think, play on people's minds.
Any reaction?
I mean, this reaction is not really to your question specifically, but it's sort of to this idea of, is it fair game to ask what people think? And I agree with you that talking heads, when you go on the air, certainly the questions that are being asked are those that are going to elicit the most provocative response. That's the nature of that medium. But I want to push back on the idea that you've suggested that, everything is fact and people are being told that that what they're reading is not true. And I wonder if there's potentially a little more gray area between false and fact. I think that a lot of current surveys out of sort of Pew and the Pointer organization show that a lot of people believe that they're reading fake news. They would call it fake news. And then when you drill down and ask them, what do you mean by fake news? They define that as opinionated coverage, coverage that has a point of view, coverage that is analysis as much as it is presenting new facts. And that's, not false, but it's not straight down the middle fact. And people seem to have trouble with that sort of middle ground. I wonder if do you think it's problematic?
There's a notion of objectivity sort of lurking in this discussion. And again, for the last 100 years, as journalism has developed and become more of an institution, the tension has been between what's described as descriptive journalism, where a disinterested and apparently a bias-free reporter could aggregate facts and write a story, versus an interpretive report, which would be more analytical. And Thomas Patterson at Harvard has argued against that. There's a kind of false sense of security in the idea of the reporters not being involved in the story. I think it's fair to say that the New York Times and the Washington Post in particular, and the LA Times as well, have really wrestled with how to deal with the president's lying. And they've made a public display of whether to use the word lie or not, and so their estimation of truth is necessarily politicized, and by some extension maybe even a partisan response if you take it in oppositional terms. But it's their job to report what happens, and if what happens is a political event in this polarized context, the position that I disagree with may be labeled false.
I'm going to have to jump in. I'm sorry, Cristina. This has been a fascinating conversation. Unfortunately, we're almost out of time. What I'd like each of you to do is 30 seconds, what message would you leave with our viewers?
This is an important discussion. We are not unbiased. The very first bias we have as reporters is we think a story is important enough to tell. So there's a bias. But, I would just say that an independent press is what's important so that we can sift through all of this.
Thanks. Cristina?
I love a paywall, and I would encourage people to pay and get behind that paywall because you're getting what you're paying for. And if you're not paying much, you're not getting much, I think, in terms of facts and quality and new information. And so I guess that's what I'd leave people with. I think it's worth as much as a latte a day to get your Times, your Post, or your Wall Street Journal.
Sure.
And I'm going to go back to the Washington Post and say democracy does die in darkness. So let's celebrate the light.
Good. Well, viewers, we thank you very much for your participation in our show. I want to thank you all also. It's been a very lively discussion. I have learned a lot from it. To our viewers, thank you for watching. On behalf of the Interreligious Council of Linn County, we wish you a good week. Take care.